Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, when Will Smith and Martin Lawrence are framed and forced to go on the run, it's ride or die for the bad boys. Mike Lowry and Marcus Burnett, played by Will Smith and Martin Lawrence, are disturbed to learn their former Captain Howard, played by Joe Pantoliano, has been framed as corrupt and working with drug cartels. Mike and Marcus set out to clear his name, aided by messages left by Howard and with the help of Mike's incarcerated son Armando, played by Jacob Scipio, who can identify the real dirty cops. But when they get too close, Mike, Marcus and Armando narrowly escape an attempt on their lives and are forced to go on the run when Mike and Marcus are framed as well. You might not believe it, but this year marks the 30th anniversary of the Bad Boys franchise. I know, scary, right? That it's been that long since the original film put Will Smith, Martin Lawrence and Michael Bay on the map. But I do have a bit of a confession to sheepishly make. I've never been a big fan of the franchise. I actually revisited the original film after I saw the second one, so maybe that tainted my expectations somewhat, but you can definitely tell that Bay is moving from being a music video director into being a film director. His style's definitely there, but it's not quite as developed as it would be, for better and for worse, in his later movies. In fact, I actually prefer some of Bay's earlier work to some of the stuff he did after it, but the problem I have with the original Bad Boys is, while it has some great set pieces, especially that big finale, because Bay knows how to handle explosions, it often feels like a sitcom, especially in the middle of the movie, where there's this kind of mix-up between Mike and Marcus with Téa Leoni. I never really could get into the first one. The second film, though, is probably what people think of when they think of Bad Boys, especially because by that point, Bay had really developed as a director. The action in that movie is absolutely insane, especially that sequence where they're throwing cars onto the freeway and all the just massive explosions that are taking place. But of course, you've got the other Michael Bay stuff as well, which includes lots of very questionable humour that I was going to say hasn't dated all that well, but I'm not sure it actually was particularly all that good back in 2003, and also an insanely overlong running time of 2.5 hours. But I do have to say that there are plenty of people that really do love Bad Boys 2, especially given that there's this kind of ironic love for it that's developed since Hot Fuzz, which very much put it prominently alongside Point Break as the kind of over-the-top cop movies that it was paying homage to. There was of course a long gap between the second and the third film, which was stuck in development hell for over a decade, but we finally got it in 2020 with Bad Boys for Life, this time with Belgian directors Adel and Blau taking the place of Michael Bay in the director's chair. And you know what? I was actually surprised at how much I liked it when I finally caught up with it in lockdown, having skipped the movie theatrically because I was so lukewarm on the series. But I thought that Adel and Blau did a great job of homaging Michael Bay's direction and maybe in some senses kind of improving on it. We'll get back to that a bit later. But if there was an issue with the movie, it's that I felt that the script was actually quite melodramatic in that film's case, especially with all these plot lines about Mike's secret love life and the paternity of Armando. Very, very sort of telenovela stuff. But 2020 being what it was one of the highest grossing films that year, so a fourth entry was very quickly announced, which for Bad Boys standards was quite a quick turnaround. Much of the team from the third film reunite for Ride or Die, including writer Chris Bremner, but a lot has happened between the two movies. Adel and Blau went on to make Batgirl, which was notoriously cancelled during post-production. Will Smith committed an incredible act of career sabotage, so the question becomes, is there still nostalgia for the Bad Boys? Can they still strike lightning in a bottle? And the answer is surprisingly yes. Given all that I've just said, you'll probably be completely unsurprised to hear that the script for Bad Boys Ride or Die is probably one of its weaker points. I know, shocking, right? But considering that it's from the same team that wrote the third movie, I do think that they replicate too much of that here at times, to the point where it almost feels like it's rehashing itself, especially in the pre-title sequence where we get a near identical opener to Bad Boys for Life, where Mike is racing around Miami, this time to get to his own wedding, and that has Marcus in the passenger seat trying again not to throw up, but this time they stop at a store where Marcus ends up getting holed up, and again that is a reference to the original Bad Boys because it's the same store, they're buying Skittles once again, and it almost feels like the series is just locked into referencing itself, and that feeling is also enhanced by the fact that we get the same cameos and guest appearances. DJ Khaled turns up again in this movie for some reason. For a whole whopping 30 seconds he pops up, and yeah, I did get a bit of a giggle out of what they do with that character, but still, why is he here for a second time? Also, a certain someone else pops up in a very Stan Lee-esque cameo. Yeah, I did kind of like that, actually. But that means that we get even more melodrama playing off the revelations of its predecessor, especially focusing on the relationship between Mike and Armando, because Mike is forced to go to his incarcerated son for help, and then, over the course of the movie, they end up forced to work together, despite the fact there's a lot of tension at play in this family dynamic, not least of which because the son is very resentful at Mike for murdering his mother, although she was trying to kill him in his defense, but also the fact that he abandoned him for 20 years. They do learn to eventually trust each other, and the boy does start to come good, you know, aside from the fact that he's murdered quite a few people over the course of these two movies, but still, there's a bit of a redemption arc going on. I was never entirely convinced by this storyline, but of course, that's because I think that the revelations about Mike's paternity are overwrought in the first place. But if there wasn't enough family dynamics at play here, we also have Captain Howard's family introduced in this movie, including his daughter, a US Marshal, who's played by Rhea Seehorn from Better Call Saul. She is very underutilized, and again, you've got this tension between her and Mike, because Armando was the one that assassinated her father in the last movie, and they introduce this daughter character as if she's been a part of these movies, even though she's actually new to this entry. You have loads of characters go, oh, you've been a part of my life for years, and things like that, and it just feels a little bit false, because you go, wait, I don't remember her being in any of these previous movies. You can't just pull out a daughter and a granddaughter completely out of thin air. Well, I guess you can in this movie's case, but you think that Seahorn's character is going to be quite important because she's leading the authorities on their tail, but actually that's not really the case at all. The character kind of drifts in and out of the narrative depending on when it needs her, and often it just simply doesn't. It feels like a character that either should have been more involved or just written out entirely. It's definitely symptomatic of a movie that has way too many characters. You've got loads of cast members brought back from previous Bad Boys movies. You've got a whole bunch of new characters as well, some of which are linked to the legacy cast. It gets a bit much for the movie to juggle. Tiffany Haddish pops up halfway through the movie because Mike and Marcus need her help, and that scene largely exists for Haddish to just be vulgar, just riff for like 3 minutes straight about Will Smith going downtown on her. There's no reason for that scene to be in the movie. The character could be completely eliminated from the script and it would have no impact on the movie whatsoever. Like, why are you even here, Tiffany Haddish? Is the only reason you're in the movie because you supported Will Smith after the slap? Is that why you're here? There's a lot of Fast and Furious DNA that seems to be dripping into the franchise, especially because there's such a large cast of characters. We've also got Ammo brought back in this movie as well, who was introduced in Bad Boys for Life. So again, we get Vanessa Hudgens and Alexander Ludwig. Noticeably absent in this outing, though, is Charles Melton, presumably because he jumped ship so he could do May December. But this extended cast of characters, call them family, if you will, does threaten to maybe pull too much of the focus away from Smith and Lawrence, which has always been the heart and focus of these Bad Boys movies. I know that they're getting older, they can't carry all of it, and I know that some of the action has been delegated to them because Lawrence especially maybe struggles with doing the big action set pieces, but even so, it does feel like there's perhaps too much going on around the characters instead of just focusing on the central pairing. The Bad Boys movies have never been known for great villains, going all the way back to the first film, which squandered Checky Cario, and Eric Danes McGrath doesn't break that cycle. Sure, he's a nasty piece of work, especially in his introductory scene, and he's a ruthless antagonist, but he's also not especially memorable. They give him a backstory about the fact that he was tortured and how that twisted him, but that doesn't really flesh out his personality all that much, and the henchmen he presides over are just generic can fodder. None of them are given any kind of distinctive trait, so that when they pop up at the end of the movie you go, yeah, I want that guy to get what's coming to him from Will Smith or whoever. You know, that stuff is satisfying in an action movie, but they still don't do it in this entry. The casting also doesn't help with the predictability of the plot. At points, there is one character that the second they walk on screen virtually you go, I'm pretty sure that person's a turncoat. And yeah, it turns out that is the case because that actor has pretty much been typecast as that role by this point. You know that that character is going to turn out to be a bad guy, and yeah, sure enough, it isn't that much of a twist. However, this is an action movie, so the plot doesn't always matter. The real question is, does it entertain? And the answer is yes. I was stupidly entertained by Bad Boys Ride or Die. Yeah, it is filled with absurd logic and plot holes, but I was also having a lot of fun, largely because Smith and Lawrence's chemistry, that still is what is carrying these movies. They have great comic timing between each other, and they know how to play off each other, and you can definitely see this in the continuing gag of Reggie from Bad Boys 2, played once again by Dennis McDonald, who literally only appears in Bad Boys movies. They keep bringing him back solely to keep referencing this bit over and over again. He's great at being a straight man foil for them, just standing there with his almost inscrutable face, but at least in this movie they actually expand upon it a bit more because he's a Marine, and so he gets an entire moment to shine, which is a bit of a crowd pleaser. And yeah, go on Reggie! There's actually a bit of a reversal of Smith and Lawrence's usual dynamic in this movie, in that Smith's Mike, he's usually the ladies' man, he's the one that kind of throws himself recklessly into the action, but this time he's actually settling down. He gets married at the beginning of the movie to Melanie Nabard, who is Christine, who is a physical therapist that was supposedly working with him when he got shot in the third movie, although actually she's a new character that again is presented like someone that we were supposed to know about previously. That character largely exists for you know what to happen, but of course he's also aware of that, so Mike spends a lot of the movie getting anxiety attacks. He's in the middle of action sequences, and then suddenly he finds himself struggling to reload his gun, kind of struggling to take decisive action in those moments in a way which is uncharacteristic for Mike. And I do think that Smith, despite the fact that he has weathered a lot of recent controversy, it does feel like going back to Bad Boys, you know, one of the franchises that made his name in the 90s, he's firmly back on comfortable territory here. Perhaps the biggest surprise of Ride or Die is that Martin Lawrence actually steals a surprising amount of this film. I know, what year is it? He's more galvanised in this than I've seen him in decades, and that's especially surprising because in the last film it looked like he was struggling to keep up. He looked like Danny Glover circa Lethal Weapon 4, where he really was too old for this shit, and they were kind of riffing on that fact he was wearing glasses, and Smith was doing much of the heavy lifting in all the action sequences, while Lawrence was contemplating retirement both in character and seemingly out of it. Whereas here, he's given so much more to do. He has a heart attack at Mike's wedding very early on, which sparks an entire bizarre subplot throughout the entire movie, because he has a vision where he meets Joe Pantoliano's Captain Howard in the afterlife, who is surprisingly calm, uncharacteristically so, telling him it's not your time. And the fact they brought back Pantoliano in a quite prominent role in the film's plot, despite being killed off in the last entry, he pops up in videos that he recorded before his death, and in these vision sequences, it always feels like a tacit admission that, yeah, it was kind of a mistake to kill his character off. I'm always down for a bit of Joe Pantoliano, but this is a really weird setup. The video thing I could kind of get behind, but the vision thing is like this weird recurring gag riffing on the fact that the character is so stressed, and then in the afterlife, he's just completely benevolent, and then towards the end of the movie, even Mike gets a vision of Captain Howard telling him, "It's not your fault. It's not your fault." Mike didn't even go to the afterlife. Why is he suddenly getting visions from Captain Howard telling him to calm down and just kind of chill out? What is happening at this precise moment? It's absolutely bonkers. But going back to Martin Lawrence's Marcus, this sets up a whole strand where Marcus feels like he cannot die. He feels like he's invincible. And this feels like a strange riff on that movie Fearless. Do you remember that from way back in the day? You know, with Jeff Bridges dancing on the edge of the building? Martin Lawrence literally homages that moment. He's up in his hospital gown, flashing his bits in his ass at people, feeling like he can't die while Mike is trying to talk him away from the edge of the building. And throughout the entire film, Marcus is throwing himself into gunfights. He's walking into traffic. He is completely without abandon whatsoever. He is totally away from the sort of, say, family man image that we normally have this character in these movies. And I think that Lawrence, given the chance to play something so different, he's leapt at the chance because there's so many comic opportunities that are offered up to him. But Marcus's sudden turn towards spirituality adds to the kind of banter between Lawrence and Smith, especially when Marcus is going on with all this stuff about, "Oh yeah, our souls have been bonded together. I met your soul, Mike, and it didn't have a penis." And Mike definitely was like, "No, it definitely did. It definitely did." It really plays up the kind of homoeroticism between the pair of them. It feels like a kind of post-Hot Fuzz kind of self-awareness of the kind of buddy cop movies. But also it just feels like Lawrence is just happily riffing on the just crazy stuff that's being given in the script. He gets an entire monologue that I'm pretty certain must be heavily improvised, where he talks about how in a previous life Mike was a donkey that he owned. It's really bizarre, like just goes completely out of nowhere. We never saw anything like this in the Vision Quest sequence whatsoever, but he's pulling all this stuff completely out of his ass. It should feel like something that could get really annoying very quickly, but actually the running gag works. It's surprisingly funny, and Lawrence seems like he's just having an absolutely great time. And then there are the action sequences, which Adel and Blau absolutely direct the hell out of. They're very much evoking a lot of what Michael Bay did in the first two movies, making sure the look is very visually consistent with what he did. But at times, I think they do Michael Bay better than Bay himself does. Yeah, Bay has those kind of unusual camera angles which they're emulating in this movie. You've got moments where you got the POV of Marcus's watch, and Bay does that, but in his movies, especially his later ones, he very much developed into that kind of fucking the frame style, as he likes to call it, where every single setup, every single shot needs to be as flashy and as stylistic as possible for maximum impact. But the problem is, when you do that near constantly, nothing has impact. You need breathing room. You need room for the audience to settle down. And I think that Adel and Blau, they know that in their direction. So that when the action sequences do arrive, that's where all the inventive camera stuff happens. And when the story needs to be told, they're not hypercutting every 3 seconds to make sure the audience is engaged. It's a decent balance of making sure that it stays close to Bay's style while still having their own directorial stamp on the material. If you've been on Twitter in the last couple of days, you might have seen the behind the scenes of them filming the gun cam stuff. Near the end of the movie, there's a point where we get the POV from Mike's gun as he's firing away at the bad guys, and then Will Smith, who's carrying the camera rig on his body, twists it around so we get this wide angle close up from the POV of the gun facing Mike, and then he tosses the gun over to Marcus, and we get the same thing with Martin Lawrence. Shows a lot of imagination, even in the staging of an action set piece in the fourth entry of a 30-year-old franchise. Adel and Blau definitely know how to make their action stand out, make it feel dynamic, but feel motivated by what is happening in it. Likewise, the The action sequence on the plane is also very well done, despite some maybe wobbly CGI towards the crash landing part, but still, that is a big set piece with a lot of variables going on screen, but it's actually communicated very well to the audience and it's really exciting. This is big, silly action done right. You know, I'm a simple man sometimes. When you introduce an alligator named Duke in your finale, with the implicit understanding that everyone in the audience knows that some sucker is gonna get eaten by the alligator at some point, call it Chekhov's alligator, if you will, and then you fulfill that promise, I want to stand up and cheer. For me, Bad Boys Ride or Die successfully feels like a throwback to those big over-the-top 90s action movies. It has that kind of crowd-pleasing mix of humour and action that you expect from the Bad Boys franchise. Smith and Lawrence are still clearly committed. They're still bringing their A game to all of this. It would have been very easy for them to just pick up the paycheck here, but they clearly have a lot of affection for the franchise that made their name. And I also think that given all the machismo and the gunfire, at its centre, it's surprisingly sweet because of the camaraderie between them. There is something quite sincere about it, even with all the goofiness that's going on around them. Now, I do have to ask myself the question, and this is going to be a really controversial statement, I can tell. I don't care at this point. It's honestly how I feel. I genuinely think that the Adil and Bilal third and fourth films might actually be better than the first and second ones that Michael Bay directed. I know, I am going to get absolutely demolished in the comments, but I stand by that opinion. I think that they're better movies than the Michael Bay ones. But whatever your taste, I think that if you like the Bad Boys franchise, this definitely is a satisfying hit of nostalgia, even if, again, it's perhaps rehashing a bit too much from its past. If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip at my Ko-fi page or my YouTube Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video. Or you can take the law into your own hands over at my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server, and you can join YouTube memberships for similar perks. Or you can simply like, share and subscribe, it all helps. Until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.